Well, last year, President Biden made Juneteenth the newest federal holiday. June 19th marks the date in 1865 when the last enslaved people in America found out that they were free. CBS News special correspondent James Brown spoke with renowned Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. about the history and the significance of Juneteenth.
Juneteenth was not embraced as a national black holiday for a long, long time, but it was kept alive by black people in Texas. And that's what's so sweet about it. Our people have been hungry for holidays, hungry for tradition, hungry for stories about black history.
Because
without a past, you have no future. Did you like Harvard?
Perhaps no one has done more to inform Americans of their past and in turn their future than Henry Louis Gates Jr. By day, he is a professor and director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard.
I'm Henry Louis Gates Jr. Welcome to Finding Your Roots.
By night, he is the host and producer of the PBS genealogy show, Finding Your Roots, as well as countless documentaries on black history.
These are the big three in the history of freedom of our enslaved ancestors. The Emancipation Proclamation, signed on January 1st, 1863, Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, and then finally the ratification of the 13th Amendment on December 6, 1865, which is what finally and ultimately abolished the institution of slavery.
Why do you think that June 19th stuck?
One of the reasons that I think Juneteenth stuck is that we're all charmed by the poetic brilliance of the name, Juneteenth. What better name for a June 19th could there possibly be? It's great, it's fetching, it's catchy.
As with all catchy names, Gates says there is also a bit of fiction around that day in 1865 when Gordon Granger issued General Order No. 3 to free the enslaved black people of Galveston, Texas, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, we were raised to think that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, right? The problem is that the Emancipation Proclamation in and of itself didn't have the power to free anybody. It only applied to enslaved people in the Confederacy, and it can only be enforced if Union troops had captured territory in the South, in the Confederacy. Only about 500,000 enslaved men and women, we think, actually got their freedom from the Emancipation Proclamation. And James, there were 3.9 million enslaved African Americans, so the overwhelming majority of our ancestors were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation.
So the significance then of General Gordon Granger going to Galveston?
We all think that the Civil War ended when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, which was April 9th, 1865. But that's not true. There were several different Confederate armies. So Texas finally surrenders to the Union on June 2nd. Gordon Granger comes, and on June 19th in Galveston, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation because now the Union Army is in possession of the territory. So that's the true story.
And what about the notion that enslaved black people in Texas did not know they were free?
One of the myths about Juneteenth is that nobody in Texas had heard about it. But there are two reasons that many historians think that black people knew about the Emancipation Proclamation too. One is because of the proverbial grapevine. So there was this miraculous way for enslaved people to communicate plantation to plantation and state to state. But the second factor is that because Texas was removed from the main action of the Civil War, many slaveholders moved to Texas for safety, and they took their enslaved people with them. Those enslaved people would have known about the Emancipation Proclamation by and large, and would have told other enslaved people. But no one could enforce it because the Union did not capture territory then. When I came here, I dedicated this tree in honor of my mother and father.
Professor Gates says the most important thing about Juneteenth is the era that came after.
The most radical thing that happened after the end of the Civil War for the rights of our enslaved ancestors were the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and the Reconstruction Acts. This was the first concentration of black power. In the summer of 1867, 80% of all eligible black men who were formerly enslaved in the South registered to vote. And in 1868, they actually voted. Ulysses S. Grant won the presidency. So you could reasonably say that black men had elected a president of the United States.
Back in Galveston, Texas, the formerly enslaved began marking their freedom with the celebration 1 year later in 1866 and have been celebrating Juneteenth ever since. As far as Professor Gates is concerned, the details of Juneteenth are less important than the power of its message.
There's a kind of poetic magic in that story, a kind of comfort, a kind of retribution, a kind of belated administering of justice that appeals to all of us. Juneteenth is one of the first holidays that black people created on their own. And of the holidays that they created in slavery times, Juneteenth is the one that survived and is now a national holiday.
Isn't it important for all Americans to understand that Juneteenth ought to be embraced by all Americans?
For a country built upon the love of freedom, any manifestation of the enjoyment of freedom should be celebrated by all our countrymen. Let's hope for that day.
In Cambridge, Massachusetts, James Brown, CBS News.